Excellency, distinguished panelists, dear guests, thank you for being here. It is my honor to read these remarks on behalf of my ambassador, Her Excellency Isabel Pico, who couldn't attend the event today. Today's discussion is of the utmost relevance in the context of the current global climate crisis, as we are now more than halfway through the 2030 agenda, and progress is nowhere near where it should be. We need to tackle collectively the necessary changes to deal with the deeply interconnected nature of the goals. Member states of the UN committed to this when they adopted the Pact for the Future last September, aimed at bolstering global cooperation to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. To this end, the international financial architecture must be adapted to the 21st century. It must be more inclusive and develop other forms of international cooperation. Investment should include an ethical component, ensuring that they take into account their impact for future generations. The idea of solidarity between generations is also of paramount importance. And that's where the fight against climate change and the protection of our natural resources are also an ethical priority that require investments with a long-term vision. Natural disasters, sea level rise, loss of biodiversity, pollution, climate refugees are challenges that we are facing now and that we will face to an even greater extent if no action is taken. The climate crisis and its consequences are also a humanitarian crisis and a threat for peace, security, and human rights. Fighting against climate change should not mean having to choose between development and environment, as both go together. Fighting climate change is a responsibility. My delegation welcomed last May the very important advisory opinion of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, which concluded that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions constitute pollution of the marine environment. That also means that the Convention imposes an obligation upon states to take all necessary measures to reduce and control marine pollution from any source and prevent such pollution from occurring at all. At regional level, the European Court of Human Rights judgment this year prescribed that the content of states' positive obligations under Article 8 of the Convention on Human Rights in the context of climate change. According to the court, states have a primary duty to adopt and to efficiently apply and practice general measures for achieving carbon neutrality within the next 3 decades. Suffice to say, my delegation will be very attentive to the advisory opinion that will be delivered by the ICJ regarding the obligations of states, as well as the legal consequences for states regarding climate change. Law is an asset and reinforces the necessity of considering ethics and sustainable development and investments. We have tremendous examples of nature-based solutions to mitigate the impact of climate change. Green investment should therefore be encouraged at national and international level. At the international level, Monaco will have the pleasure to host, in advance of UNOC 2025, the Blue Economy and Finance Forum on 7 and 8 June 2025. We're confident that this event will help maintaining the attention on harnessing and financing a sustainable ocean-based economy. Greater efforts need to be made to curb and reorient the financial flows away from damaging activities towards opportunities in future-oriented areas, and to better advocate for the mutual understanding that ocean protection is in everyone's interest. For the ocean economy to be sustainable, ocean finance has to be adequate and oriented towards the conservation and sustainable use of the ocean and its resources towards activities, policies, and actions that minimize ocean threats and maximize economic potential. To this end, innovation has an important role to play. For example, innovative finance such as blue bonds, debt for ocean swaps, or the ongoing development of new financial instruments for marine biodiversity. We need more blue innovations in the economy. Finally, we must keep in mind that the protection of the planet and the preservation of our ecosystems and biodiversity are not only ensured through direct financing. An eco-responsible behavior is key to foster climate resilience, especially concerning private enterprises. For this reason, the government of Monaco provides assistance to Monaco-based companies wishing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate their energy transitions. These enterprises are provided with policy advice from expert consultants for a low-carbon strategy, which also allows them to be more competitive on the market as they stand out by their eco-responsible products and services. We shall spare no effort in investing in an economy that supports nature and its people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valley, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Our panel discussion today will focus on some of the moral and ethical dimensions of green investment, the legal environment, moderating such initiatives, and the contributions that both can make towards sustainable development. The Sovereign Order of Malta, through its permanent observer status at the United Nations, is deeply committed to promoting the welfare of our primary constituents, the poor, the sick, and those who are left behind. Today's event reflects this commitment and is framed around the comments made by Pope Francis in his paper on climate change, Laudate Deum, where he exhorts us not to fall with the mentality of maximum gain at minimum cost, which makes it impossible for any sincere concern for our common home and any real preoccupation about assisting the poor and the needy. Today, our discussion will touch on a variety of issues relating to this theme and will explore the practicalities of using our economic instruments, our technologies, and our will to both sustain and to develop our environment. It's my privilege now to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Mr. Kurt Voigt. Kurt is a distinguished leader in the field of sustainable finance, bringing more than 30 years of experience in banking and investment. He's currently the managing director of HPL LLC, a company dedicated to advisory services in sustainable finance across the Americas. Kurt's extensive career includes senior roles at Citi and HSBC, Latin America, where he played a pivotal role in advancing green, social, and sustainable financing initiatives in the region. In 2017, Kurt founded HP LLC, and his influence extends further as a member of the board of directors of the La Green Luxica Fund, a green bond fund focused in Latin America, and as an advisory board member for BirdLife International, a global conservation organization. Kurt holds impressive academic background, degrees from the University Ibero-America, Harvard Business School, and the Columbia University, where he earned his Master's of Science in Sustainable Management. With his wealth of experience and unwavering dedication to sustainability, Kurt is exceptionally well suited to guide us through today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Kurt Voigt.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for your kind words, and thank you very much for inviting me to lead this very interesting discussion. So let's get started. So the encyclical Laudato Si, where Pope Francis basically says climate change is one of the, or is the biggest challenge facing humanity. And it has an impact on our environment, it has an impact on our economy, on society, and obviously on politics. But it has also an asymmetric impact on the poor. If we take some data from the World Bank, if climate change is not properly handled, we will see forced migration of 200 million people. We are going to see another 130 million people pushed into poverty. So it's a huge problem, and so today we're gonna in our talk we're gonna talk about 4 areas. We're 4 speakers, and that we are going to talk about. Number 1, how should we rethink the relationship between humans and nature? That is more on the moral side, and that's the basis for everything else. And then we're going to talk about laws, how environmental law is being designed with that in mind. Then we're going to talk about technology. What are the technologies that can actually move the needle? And we're going to talk about one of them. And then we are going to talk about how the financial system can be activated to actually finance everything, to finance decarbonization, inequality, conservation. So let me get started here and introduce Dr. Anthony Annett, our first speaker. Dr. Annett is the author of Cathonomics, How Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy. He was a climate change and sustainable development advisor at the Earth Institute here in Columbia University. He led the Earth Institute initiative to strengthen the engagement of the world religious communities in the climate change and sustainable development agenda. Dr. Annett spent 2 decades at the International Monetary Fund, including as a speechwriter of the managing director. He holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University and is a member of the College of Fellows of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Kurt, and thank you all for coming here. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in the UN after quite a few years, I would have to say. I want to just for a few minutes talk a little bit about Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which is almost 10 years old now. Next spring, it'll be 10 years old. I can't believe the time has gone so quickly. I remember when it came out in summer of 2015, I was at the Vatican at an event on Laudato Si that was addressed by Pope Francis. And the first thing Pope Francis said was, Laudato Si is not a green encyclical, it's a social encyclical. So it's about our common humanity and our common home. It's really based on this new principle of Catholic social teaching called integral ecology, which is really saying that the relationships between humanity, human beings, and the natural world are interconnected, intertwined, and all part of a larger whole. Accordingly, if we upset the balance of nature, we upset the conditions for human flourishing, especially when it comes to the poor. And that's the key to understanding integral ecology, that environmental havocs are not just concerns of the planet, they are concerns with the people, to use some UN lingo. This gives rise to a moral injunction to care for and protect creation. Because when we degrade creation, we degrade the potential for people to flourish. Again, to quote Pope Francis, we are called upon to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Now, this feeds directly into the Sustainable Development Agenda, because as Laudato Si says very clearly, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and one social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Therefore, we need an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And I would argue that this is a moral charter for sustainable development, and it's no coincidence that Pope Francis opened that famous session of the UN General Assembly in September 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were endorsed. But let's talk a little bit about Laudato Si and what it is and what Pope Francis is saying. For Pope Francis, the problem is theological. For him, the biblical injunction to have dominion over creation has been misinterpreted, giving rise to what he calls a disordered anthropocentrism. So he claims that the original harmony between creator, humanity, and creation has been ruptured, And this disruption, this rupture, is brought about by human arrogance, hubris, and selfishness. Pope Francis criticizes what he calls a technocratic paradigm combined with an individualism that puts its blind faith in the market. The problem, he says, lies in the midst of a modernity grounded in a utilitarian mindset by which he identifies the faults and the flaws of individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, and the unregulated market. Pope Francis says that this paradigm has become globalized and it now dominates politics and it dominates economics. And it justifies an economic model that says we can just ignore and burst through the planetary boundaries. This is a confrontational vision and based on an ethos of possession, mastery, and transformation. And I would argue that Pope Francis is actually in a very deep manner criticizing the Enlightenment philosophy of philosophers like René Descartes, who argued along those lines that everything, that creation is just a formless mass that we can mold to our own benefit, as opposed to a common home that supports our communal flourishing. This mentality, says Pope Francis, means that our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and consciousness. Pope Francis is also, as well as giving a diagnosis of what's going wrong, is also providing a roadmap for how to get out of this. He is calling for a different type of progress, one that is, to quote, healthier, more human, more social, more integral. It is a call for what he calls integral and sustainable human development, which again is very much aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Pope Francis is calling for conversion of both individuals and societies. He says, yes, we need ecological conversion at the level of the individual. Even if efforts can be small, they can have moral multiplier effects as one person's behavior can influence others in a positive manner. But he also says self-improvement on the part of individuals just is not enough on its own, given an extremely complicated situation that we face in our world today. So therefore, we need solutions at the economic level, at the political level, at the global level, and at the national level. The key point for Pope Francis, he says, interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. And that calls for a replacement of highly polluting fossil fuels with renewable energy without delay. And that was taken up even more strongly in his follow-up document called Laudate Deum, where he says that this challenge has become more urgent since the publication of Laudato Si. And everyone has a role here, not just governments, but business and civil society too. Everybody must bear common responsibility for our common home. But Pope Francis also warns that action has been hindered by strong vested interests. He says there are too many special interests, and economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. He says that many of those who possess the most resources and economic and political power seem mostly concerned with masking the problems and concealing the symptoms. That's a very profound indictment of the world we live in today. And in a 2018 address to oil company executives at the Vatican, Pope Francis actually says that we need to talk together, industry, investors, researchers, and consumers, about the transition and the search for alternatives to fossil fuels. He says civilization requires energy, yes, but energy must not destroy civilization. And therefore, I will merely conclude, since we have quite a few people to speak today, so I really conclude by saying that we can appeal to Laudato Si and the wisdom of Pope Francis, but also the wisdom of all the different religious traditions, which in their own way also provide a moral basis for combating climate change and furthering sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Annett. So yeah, Pope Francis is making a very important point of cause-effect. No, you protect nature, you protect humanity, and you gotta combat poverty and nature degradation. So this fight is a moral imperative, and now we're gonna talk about the different building blocks that I talked about at the beginning. How to do this fight, no? And the first one that we're going to talk about is rules and regulation and developing environmental law that actually is going to be conducive to deal with this problem. And who better than Achinti Vithanaj to talk about this? Professor Vithanaj is Associate Director of Environmental Law Programs at Pace University in New York. She has a unique international perspective. She was born in Sri Lanka, lived in the United Arab Emirates, practiced as an attorney in the state of New South Wales in Australia. She undertook tertiary studies in Australia, Japan, China, Spain, and the United States. Since her arrival in the United States, Professor Vithanaj is recognized as one of the country's leading environmental and energy lawyers. Professor Vithanaj is in the 2023 and 24 Law Dragon 500 leading environmental lawyers list. So please, Achinti, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Kurt, for your introduction, and I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, all. It's really nice to be back here in again. Let me first express my sincerest thanks to the Ambassador and the Permanent Observer Mission of the Sovereign Order of Malta, as well as the Permanent Mission of Monaco, for this kind invitation to speak to you all today. Dr. Annett has quite exquisitely expressed that moral duty that we hold to respond to the environmental and social crises of our time. Now, as an environmental lawyer, I look to the law as a tool to achieve our aims, whether it comes to environmental protection or conservation or sustainable development. Now, as a professor of environmental law, I encourage my students of the law's ability to ensure that we're not only just looking for environmental aims, but we're also looking for its just implementation. And that's going to be part of that key importance of bringing in morality into this. So for the next few minutes, I invite you to indulge with me in a few things. The making of environmental law, if you can go to the next slide, please. Examining how environmental law is placed to respond to our environmental crises and promote sustainable development. Surveying the many shapes and forms that environmental law can take. Considering how environmental law is then challenged and its lofty goals somewhat thwarted sometimes. And of course, imagining the legislative environment that is needed to enable our sustainable development goals. So let me begin. I'm going to leave this up there because that's just my signpost for you as to how I walk through it. Now, the law is inherently contextual. It is responsive to the character or the conduct of activity that it attempts to try and govern. Now, the touchstone of environmental law, for instance, is ecological injury caused by human activity. Now, that is, environmental law seeks to regulate human activity in order to limit ecological impacts that threaten public health and biodiversity. Now, environmental law does not consider human transformation of the environment per se as unlawful, right? What it rather tries to do is it believes that ecological transformation is somewhat unavoidable. It will happen, and often it is desirable too. But what it tries to do is it seeks to influence the kind, the degree, and the pace of that transformation. So our gravitation towards sustainable development, and not just environmental sustainability, it really exemplifies this, right? We're looking for that sustainable element with development. Think of also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. We aim to reduce warming to below 1.5 degrees to slow the pace of ecological transformation, slow the pace of warming, not to necessarily prevent it. Consider also the environmental permit schemes that are happening in any of your countries that you come from, where we allow environmental pollution in accordance with permits, instead of necessarily banning that pollution altogether. You will also have noticed that environmental law is strongly influenced by cultural values, social norms, and environmental ethics. So think of the rise of the environmental movement in the 1970s. The dominant cultural value was, of course, growing awareness of the need to protect the environment, and that human exploitation was affecting that. So leading to this strong emphasis on conservation, sustainability, and responsible stewardship. The movement also led to a host of environmental laws here in the United States, like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Now, globally, the environmental movement was also led to that formulation of key international environmental law principles, such as what you might recall from the Stockholm Conference in 1972. We had the precautionary principle, or pollution prevention, intergenerational equity. Science also plays a very important role in environmental law, more so than most other areas of law you might find. We see it in environmental law's reliance on best available science for when it comes to planning. How about the level of risk that is permitted through environmental laws, the assessment of impacts, taking precautionary measures, and so on. So whatever its motivations and influences, environmental law is ultimately a tool or an asset, as Councillor Valley mentioned earlier. Now these can be used to respond to the environmental issues that we have and to kind of point society towards more sustainable roads. And it might do so in a variety of ways. It could completely ban an activity with adverse environmental impacts. Consider the country of Gabon and its banning of raw timber exports to support forest protection. We could regulate environmentally harmful activities and penalize them. So think about Singapore and their strict and high penalties when it comes to littering, right? And there's also laws that require anyone who's a repeat offender to then engage in community service to understand the impacts of that action. We can use environmental law to incentivize good behavior through benefits, finance, or deregulation, what we call carrots sometimes in terms of trying to entice someone. Think of the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States and its host of incentives to try and support that renewable energy transition. Environmental law also tries to mandate disclosure and transparency through regulation. You can think of the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive as one of those examples, requiring companies to disclose information on their environmental, social, and governance performance. We also use environmental law to set environmental goals. So think of the 30 by 30 initiative to protect 30% of land and waters by 2030. In New York here, we had legislation that was introduced in 2022 that sets that as a goal and in terms of supporting the federal policy on that level. But of course, meanwhile, we have Bhutan, who has a constitutional requirement to manage 60%, to protect 60% of its forests. Environmental law can also be used through the Constitution to grant rights to protect the environment. This is a way for citizens to be empowered to fight for those environmental rights. We can also use taxes, like sticks, to change behavior and build finance. And countries have introduced, for instance, carbon taxes to fund some of the transition that we need to clean energy. And of course, this goes on. We could add procedural requirements to try and ensure community engagement is included. We can ensure that concepts that like environmental justice or climate justice underpin some of the environmental law foundations so that we can ensure what we do have is a just transition. So many of these examples of environmental laws, though not all, are westernized approaches to environmental law, which is kind of predominantly anthropocentric, pursuing ecological transformation in support of human needs. And so indigenous approaches that we also have, there are also indigenous approaches to environmental law. And these redistribute that focus away from the human focus to more an ecological focus, right? Making it more ecocentric. So consider the recognition of a river in New Zealand, the Wanganui River, that was given rights, and that's symbolic of how important it is to the indigenous tribes of that country. And this is a way where we can use indigenous law then to reframe the application of environmental law. And of course, what I have covered is also only a brief sampling of environmental laws. There are so many in many different shapes and forms, and with varying levels of success depending on where they are introduced. But environmental law can be a very flexible tool and can be adaptable to country circumstances. At the international level, of course, so I've been talking mostly about domestic, but at the international level, environmental law becomes even more complicated. We're asking 190 plus countries with various environmental laws of their own, not to mention their own geographies and histories and backgrounds and cultures and capacities, to then come together on one course, right, on how to address one environmental issue, whether it is climate change, plastics, or biodiversity protection. So in the need for consensus, sometimes the making of international environmental law becomes a really enormous challenge. And it is only one of the many challenges that environmental law faces. So environmental law, while it can be a tool for positive change, it is not always done well. Sometimes environmentally adverse consequences are also introduced in that process, sometimes even under the guise of environmental law's moral umbrella. The development of law can also be slow and not rapid enough for the pace of environmental impacts that are being experienced. But that is not to say that it cannot be faster. Where we do see environmental law emerge, we are seeing it developed based on an underestimation sometimes of those environmental impacts themselves, instead of really applying the precautionary principle. Products can enter the market unless they are shown to be toxic, instead of products being expected to be shown they are not toxic before they enter the market. Environmental also sometimes looks really great on paper, but are not backed by adequate enforcement capacity and follow-through. We also talked about the mismatch of environmental ethics, where we spoke in terms of what we stand for versus the legal commitments that we are willing to make to those ethics. There's also political instability, the rollback of environmental laws, and all of these lends to uncertainty when it comes to impacting ethical investment. So how we choose to invest in our future will be a defining moment in this period of great environmental crises, which brings us to the theme of, again, today's panel of how investment can contribute to environmental goals, while also generating some of those financial returns for investors. And green investments is one of those things that my next panelist will talk about. But what I do want to identify are some ways that environmental law can look to green investment and either promote it through carrots, for instance, or kind of regulate it through sticks to make sure that it's done well. This could be developing standardized criteria for identifying what are true green investments. You can use certification schemes to make sure that they're done in a proper way and there's third-party analysis of it. You can have greenwashing laws that are on the books that are then enforced consistently. Introducing industry-specific environmental and sustainability regulations and standards, because they don't have to be always across the board. Industry-specific ones are needed. And of course, mandating extensive disclosure, reporting of ESG criteria. Imposing penalties on bad actors and making sure that that's continued and done consistently to make sure that everyone understands what the case is. So ultimately, the last thing I want to do is just what takeaways that are for you all. Environmental law is inherently a product of its times. And so if we're going to have public citizenry really invest in redefining that relationship between humans and nature, it can also show up through our legal frameworks. There is a need for a universal understanding and commitment to both environmental ethics and principles, but also science to bolster environmental law when it is implemented. Environmental law can come in lots of different forms, and it's an adaptable tool, but it also means that there are lots of opportunities out there for us to taste and check and try out what others have already tried. There are many examples of environmental law applied throughout the world, and we can really look to them, not just domestic, national ones, but also subnational levels. And of course, we must also recognize that environmental law's positive benefits can only be achieved through a commitment to legal enforcement. All right, and with that, I think I will end my comments here.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. So yeah, just thinking about what you said, I mean, environmental law gets the economic actors to actually do what they are doing with an eye on nature, and also financial institutions. By the way, I mean, they need to be reporting things. They need to be thinking about nature as well, and social inequality, and have that in mind when financing projects. So Dorian will now show us some examples. Let me introduce Dorian. Dorian van Raalte joined Gresham House in December 2023, and is an investment manager within the forestry division covering asset management both in the UK and internationally. Prior to Gresham House, he spent 5 years at Sail Ventures, an alternatives investment firm based in the Netherlands, where he was part of the founding team of a 400 million global climate fund focused on agriculture and forestry. He is affiliated to the University of Oxford Environmental Change Institute, where he advises on financing and scaling investment in nature-based solutions. So Dorian holds a first-class Bachelor of Business Science in Finance and Accounting, and a postgraduate diploma in accounting. He got honors on it from the University of Cape Town, as well as a first-class MSc in Climate Change Management and Finance from Imperial College of London. He also has a CFA. So go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Kurt, for that comprehensive introduction. I really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the ambassadors for the opportunity. As Kurt mentioned, my focus is very much in the sustainable land use space. This is a space that I've been very interested in from a young age, having grown up on a farm in South Africa in a very rural part of the country. And I had a father who's very interested in conservation. As Kurt mentioned, for my part of the proceedings today, I intend to really get into the weeds a bit to provide you with a real-life example of an innovative strategy focusing on promoting sustainable land use. Just to start, I would like to give you a bit of background. I work for Gresham House. It's a specialist asset manager. We focus on the key areas driving the transition to a low carbon and more sustainable world. So this includes renewable energy, sustainable infrastructure, and natural capital. And through a focus on these areas, Gresham House has grown its assets under management in the last 10 years from effectively zero to about 11 billion today. This is very much a growing space. And we're the 9th largest natural capital managers globally, which is where I sit within the organization. So just to give you a bit of background, I'm sure everyone here in the room is well aware, we need to rapidly transform how we manage land globally. Humans highly depend on nature and its services. According to the World Economic Forum, approximately 50% of the global GDP relies on ecosystem services. But we're unsustainably managing land. Agriculture, forestry, and other land use contribute to about 1/5 of global emissions. We're losing topsoil, and this is impacting livelihoods and food security. We need to transform how we manage our land. That is clear. And this requires large amounts of investment. It is estimated that we need to increase annual investment in agriculture, forestry, and land use by between 10 and 30 times to meet the Paris Agreement targets. That's significant. And we're only going to do this by scaling private sector capital into sustainable land use. This requires a joint effort by all stakeholders, the private sector, the public sector, academics, and the greater third sector. Some of the research I've done at the University of Oxford looks at the new generation of investment managers, and I apologize, I understand the text is quite small. But we mapped the 25 leading nature funds and investment firms globally. And what we saw was really positive. These actors are focused, they're purpose-built, they're integrated, and they have diverse teams. And they're implementing complex and tailored investments and are having very real impact on the ground today. However, these actors have limited track record, and they manage a small amount of capital in the greater scheme of things. And greater private-public collaboration can assist in making this tool more effective and positively influencing land use at scale. One of our examples in the report is the Green Fund managed by Sale Ventures. And Sale is a first-time manager, a fund manager. Green is a fund I know intimately, as Kurt mentioned earlier. Prior to Gresham House, I spent 5 years at Sale Ventures, where I joined in 2017 as the firm's first employee. I was part of the original team and was tasked with launching and scaling the Green Fund. I thought to focus on Green because of its track record, having been operational for around 7 years now. And it also provides a good example of a public-private collaboration and the role of innovative finance solutions. The Green Fund was launched at Paris 2015, with the Norwegian government providing a $100 million grant to get it off the ground. Green's goal is to de-link soft commodity production and deforestation. So it essentially focuses on all the dirty sectors. Think cattle in Brazil, palm oil in Indonesia, a mix of smallholder crops in Africa, and looks to finance leading actors and blueprint models within these supply chains to clean them up and support sustainable production. Green does this by providing long-term, purpose-built debt with environmental and social conditions. There are two key things I want to highlight about Green. First, the role of soft capital and blended finance. The Norwegian government provided a $100 million grant, which provided Green with the seed capital it needed to get off the ground and start building a track record. From day one, we sought to build a portfolio that was interesting to the private sector and to institutional investors, because that's how you get from millions to billions. To do this, one needs to have impact, sure, but more importantly, the strategy has to offer attractive risk-return profile, as institutional investors have fiduciary duties to pensioners, policyholders, shareholders, and other stakeholders. As the fund grew its track record, we were able to add different layers of capital, grants, and then redeemable grants and concessional loans from DFIs. These different types of capital can not only help build the track record and support the strategy early, but can also act as a first loss buffer, thereby changing the risk-return profile of a strategy and assisting in making an investment into a fund or a new strategy more attractive for more commercial pockets of money. Kurt will touch on this later in his presentation, so I will stop and not steal his thunder. But the key point here is that soft capital from the various actors shown at the bottom of the slide were pivotal in getting the strategy off the ground. The next key thing I would like to speak about is the carrot and stick approach. Transforming land use requires large amounts of upfront capital. Typically, these investments only bear fruit years down the line. Thus, traditional capital and finance in the market is not very well suited. In contrast, Green is able to tailor its investments to the project. This includes things like structuring grace periods on interests and principal payments so that the cash flow of the facility are well aligned to the underlying project. Green is also able to provide technical assistance and expertise to enable supply chain actors to tackle complex ESG problems such as traceability. Green's backing also comes with an important stamp of approval for supply chain actors. These are all different carrots that make Green's finance very attractive, but it comes with conditions. Sale builds into Green's loans environmental, social, and governance conditions. These include a commitment to no deforestation, requirements to implement environmental and social action plan that align to international standards such as IFC performance standards, and quantitative targets around areas such as natural forest protected, natural forest restored, livelihood supported, and production areas intensified. These are public commitments. They are binding. And this is a real stick. There is accountability. As if Green's clients don't deliver, they default on their loan facilities, which has real financial and reputational consequences. This is an example of an Green investment. Roncador is one of the largest cattle farms in Brazil. It covers an area of about 150,000 hectares, so 25 odd Manhattans. Green provided a long-term loan with back-ended payments to help Roncador scale up an integrated crop livestock model to cover more than 60,000 hectares. Through this model, Roncador is able to increase its stocking capacity, almost doubling it, and improve the soil quality, assisting in increasing yields and carbon sequestration. This means it can produce more efficiently and sustainably on the same area of land, taking pressure off land use. In return for capital, Roncador committed to protecting more than 70,000 hectares of tropical forest. Roncador also committed to achieving early compliance with the Brazilian Forest Code and agreed to knowledge sharing with research institutions, industry groups, and farmers. These commitments and others were built into the loan agreement and made publicly available on the ANGreen website. In summary, I think this is a good example of how innovative finance can support a blueprint model to scale and have real impact at a landscape level. Very briefly, this was the status of the ANGreen Fund when I moved on about 2 years ago. And it has recently raised another 180 million from the Green Climate Fund in December 2023. It's currently in the market looking to raise large amounts of capital from private sector investors. And it's having very real impact on the ground, as can be seen by these metrics. However, ultimately time will tell how successful it is, and raising large volumes of private sector capital will be pivotal in this regard. In closing, my key messages are these. We need to transform land use significantly. This requires scaling private sector finance. The new generation of nature investors that we see emerging can play an important and pivotal role. Public and private partnerships have significant potential to scale innovative solutions. And lastly, land is complex. We need investors with diverse and integrated teams. We need solutions to come from the grassroots up. And most importantly, for on-the-ground solutions to be successful, we need a balance of environmental, social, and financial interests. This makes sense intuitively in land use. I like to think of the family farm, my father's farm, for instance. The farmer is a custodian and steward of the land. It will be handed down from generation to generation, and a long-term outlook makes sense. The farmer has an incentive to protect the soil quality through cover crops and no tillage to ensure yields continue in the future. The farmer has incentive to treat employees well and work together with stakeholders in the landscape to have a social license to operate. And importantly, the farm needs to be profitable so that the farmer can live. And that last point is so important to scaling landscape finance. Investments need to deliver a return and be attractive from a risk-return perspective to attract private sector capital. And that's how we will get from the millions to billions that we require to have transformational impact. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's working. Well, thank you very much, Dorian. Really interesting. I mean, how to scale land use. No, you need all the stakeholders aligned: the public sector, the private sector. You need to adapt your investment processes. You need to engage the behavior on the ground level, as you just said. So really. It's a challenge, but finance can do it. That's the message. So now let's move to the next building block, which is basically technology. The scientific community is really a huge player in the fight against climate change, and we need a lot of solutions. And Dr. Klaus Lackner is going to talk about a couple of them, or one of them specifically. Dr. Lackner is the director of the Lenfest Center for Sustainable Energy at Columbia University. He is also an Ewing Wurzel Professor of Geophysics at the Department of Earth and Environment Engineering. He was. At the University of Arizona, he is the director of the Center of Negative Carbon Emissions at the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering. He is a theoretical physicist and has made a number of contributions to the field of carbon capture and storage since 1995. In 1999, he was the first person to suggest the artificial capture of carbon dioxide from air in the context of carbon management. Dr. Lachner holds a PhD, summa cum laude, in physics from Heidelberg University in 1978. He was awarded the Clem Haas Prize for his outstanding thesis. Please go ahead, Dr. Lachner.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. I look at it from a, could you move to the next slide? I'm looking at it more from a technical perspective, and so as engineer or as scientists, we like to divide and conquer and figure out which pieces we can break off and deal with. And if you look at climate change, it's a very complicated issue. But one aspect stands out. CO2 is by far the dominant greenhouse gas, and CO2 comes nearly completely from the emissions from fossil fuels. So that's where we are. And unlike the other greenhouse gases, which will eventually go away, particularly methane has a lifetime of a decade, that CO2 is with us for thousands of years. So as a consequence, the damage we do is effectively permanent unless we have technological solutions to fix it. And I would argue, if you go to the next slide, by the way, I would argue that we either already have entered an overshoot and are beyond where we should be, or we have enough inertia in the system that we can't possibly help ourselves to overshoot and end up in territory where the warming is simply too much. So if you look at it from that perspective, you then have to also realize that energy is critical to the well-being of a developing world, particularly if you look at people who don't have a decent standard of living today. If we want them to catch up, we can't help but greatly increase energy consumption. And so we have to figure out how to make this transition, because if we very suddenly stop all the fossil fuel, we are in deep trouble. And on the other hand, it's also very clear we are looking for technological solutions that are carbon neutral and don't rely on fossil fuels anymore. But in the meantime, I would argue the fossil fuel industry has created an enormous carbon waste management problem, because if you think about it this way, we are now for the last 200, 250 years digging up carbon for the sole purpose of having energy. Nobody wants that much carbon. It turns out we are making more CO2 than we can consume in sand and aggregate. So we have to think about this as a waste disposal problem. For every ton of carbon coming out of the ground, another has to be put back in. So the first question is that technically feasible? And the other one, how would you actually pay for this? I would argue technologies to do all of this exist and have been started to be developed for decades now, certainly in some areas, but they are all immature, which is not all that surprising. If you think about it for a moment, nobody ever had asked for them. So, of course, there's no demand for it, so there's no way of maturing it. But if you start looking at it, the IPCC report from 2005 already points out there's plenty of storage capacity in geological storage, porous spaces underground into which you could inject CO2, and in all likelihood for the vast majority of them, it would stay there and be safe and permanent. I have another aspect which the IPCC report looked at. I was an advocate for at the time and still am, that we should actually mineralize things. CO2 is an asset. If you give me a base, and plenty of rocks are base, I can turn that into solid carbonates, either deep underground or in industrial processes on the surface, and we can put that CO2 away that way. We also need ways of getting our hands on the CO2. The first thing to have been developed there already in the 1990s are ways of collecting CO2 at the big point sources. Think power plants, refineries, steel plants, cement plants, those kind of places. We can scrub the CO2 out there and then dispose of it as a waste, as I just discussed. I think that will never be enough, because if you look at it, roughly half of all the emissions come from other sources. So in the late 90s, I worked on the idea that we could actually collect the CO2 directly from the atmosphere and pull it out of the atmosphere and put away that way. Now, you may say this is hopeless because it's so dilute, and by the way, that was my first reaction too when I started to look at it. But if you simply do a very simple arithmetic and you say, I have a cubic kilometer of air, which is what a big windmill sees in an afternoon, and I pay you 5 cents a kilowatt hour for this kind of energy, it's worth about $300 worth of energy. If I give you a tipping fee for the CO2 in that same air at $30 a ton, I would get $21,000 worth. I'm effectively 70 times more concentrated than windmills, the kinetic energy windmills go after, and we have no trouble going after that. So I'm rather sure we can do that. And I have worked out, and others have worked out, if you want a device which can collect a ton a day, you're talking about a machine which I could shove into a shipping container and deliver wherever you want. So if you wanted to get the scale we are currently emitting, you would need 100 million such shipping containers, because that's the 36 gigatons we are actually emitting. If you now look at it from that perspective, if they last 10 years, I would have to build 10 million a year, every year from here on in the future. Shanghai Harbor ships out 50 million shipping containers. So we have the industrial capacity. By the way, we build 100 million cars and trucks a year too. So we have the industrial capacity to do these things if we choose to do them. And so we can capture the carbon dioxide and we can dispose of it. And as we start thinking about it, we can also go one step further, because the sequestration, by doing it, actually enables alternatives of recycling the carbon where it's useful. Now, if you just collect 10% to make plastics, you will never close the carbon cycle. If, on the other hand, you say we don't need fossil fuels to have fuels for airplanes and ships and trucks, I could instead make synthetic fuels from solar energy or other renewable energy and combine it with CO2 to make liquid fuels of my choice. And don't underestimate the value of liquid fuels in this environment. It would also do something else, because it would give the photovoltaic panels, the renewable energy, an outlet for intermittent power, which it cannot put in the market because the grid cannot handle it. So we can put to the side of those grid connections the connections to making synthetic fuels and put that then into the market. So you could be in Boston at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, and you have no wind and no sunshine, but you are burning fuel in a power plant that came from West Texas 6 months earlier. So the bottom line is it really affordable? And I would argue right now it's not. If you look at it, it's somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a ton to just collect the CO2, leave alone store the CO2, although that's likely the smaller part. On the other hand, I'm quite optimistic on that, because learning by doing has done fantastic things. If you look at windmills, they are 50 times cheaper today than they were in the 70s. Solar energy is about 200 times cheaper than it was in the 70s. Here, we only have to get a factor 10 cheaper to be in a good place. If the cost were $30, $40 a ton of CO2, or even $100 a ton of CO2, the world could afford it. So if you go to the last slide. If you think about it as a waste management problem, we have ignored the waste so far, and certainly for CO2. On the other hand, we have learned to do this before for other things, right? If you think about London and the big stink, eventually it was too dramatic, and people said, we can do that. But by the way, if you read the stories about it, this was equally impossible to dealing with the CO2. Tunnels under all the major cities in the world is just not feasible. So CO2 is waste, and it's global, and it can be addressed globally, but it's also important for this discussion, because if you do it via direct air capture, you can collect it anywhere and put it anywhere. And so rich countries can do it, poor countries can do it, they can be paid for it. All of this is doable from that perspective. And carbon recycling, making synthetic fuels, I predict will be driven by that, because the cost of the waste disposal will make it very interesting. So my prediction is that if you go forward 50 years, climate change will hurt, we will really do something, and at that point we will phase out fossil carbon, but we still have liquid fuels, which we make that way. And I close on this, and thank you for your attention.
Wonderful, Dr. Lackner. Yeah, I mean, if you think about how many industries have committed to go to net zero by 2050, you know, and at the end, there are a lot of technologies that we don't know yet which ones of these technologies are going to work to get to this point. No, but what you have described, I mean, is one of the technologies that can actually work and can get cost efficient.
And it's one of a larger
exactly, and
portfolio.
This could be a big one. No? But at the end of the day, I mean, we need to think about the scientific community as a very big source of the solution. So anyway, I will do a very short part of my presentation in order to get to the end. My first, I'm gonna talk about three things: how financial instruments have been designed to actually deal with climate change and social aspects. I will talk a little bit about investor mobilization and about conservation finance. What I want to show you here is how, through the journey that the Chilean government went through, I will explain to you the financial instruments of green, social, sustainability bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. No? The Chilean government in 2019 started issuing green bonds. And as you can see here, these were like the categories that they were allowed to invest in as a result of the issuance of these instruments. The way the instrument works is every dollar that you issue needs to be applied to categories that are considered green by the International Capital Markets Association. But that is a use of proceeds bond. After 3 years, they reached a point where they had issued already $7.5 billion, and they saw an opportunity to increase the type of categories that they would be allowed to invest in, and added all social categories. That's where our company got involved in putting together the framework for that. And you can see the categories that are listed there. That allowed them to issue another almost $30 billion of these instruments. But the third generation of sustainable finance instruments that they have used is the sustainability-linked bond. And there, essentially, the money of the bond can be used for whatever in this case the country would like to, but the country needs to make a commitment, a sustainability commitment, and get rewarded or penalized if that commitment is not achieved. And the interesting part of what Chile did with this was that they embedded the NDCs in these targets. So essentially, they put their money where their mouth is, and put it into these financial instruments. No, as you know, the NDCs are not necessarily legally binding, but here they bite. Right, so that is a very interesting thing. And what is also interesting is that bonds have, you can issue 5, 10, 15, 20-year bonds. So the life of these instruments go beyond the term of any president, no, in a normal democracy, of course. But that has also a lot of value in terms of putting in place stability in policies, and in this case, environmental and social policies. The second thing, I will be very, very brief on this one, is how, let's say, a government, let's say in this case the European government, the German and EU, how they can punch above their weight with their, let's say, investment dollars or euros in this case, to actually have an effect on climate change through investing in the emerging markets. So what they basically do is they put their dollar or their euro in the form of capital into a fund, and are willing to take first losses, and are willing to obtain a lower return on their investment, in order to entice a multiple of the €1 that they put in, to entice the private sector to put a multiple into the fund. And then the idea is to mobilize all that capital to invest in green bonds, in this case in Latin America. I happen to be in the board of that fund, and it's a lot of fun. Like, we are investing in interesting bonds, and we help also the issuers with technical assistance to be ready to issue these bonds. Finally, I'll just make a comment on conservation. Conservation is difficult to finance, as you described, no? But at the end of the day, if you have a good conservation project, you can get philanthropy to be a key stakeholder, and then around the philanthropy, you bring in the governments or corporations or investors, and put together transactions in order to finance them. So I will end here with a summary of our day today. So essentially, Dr. Annette started with the integral ecology, where essentially what we are saying is the environment is not separate from social and economic issues. It's a one complex problem, and this is probably the most complex problem that we all have faced as humanity. So then we have Professor Vintage, that you talked about the carrots and the sticks, right? So essentially, you get the actors like companies, scientists, and governments to act in a certain way if you put this into the law. And Dorian talked about, okay, what is a dividend, for instance, like putting all these things together and invest in scaling sustainable food production. I mean, that is the holy grail if you think about it. Can you make it? Can you make that competitive and as you say, allow the farmer make money, but also produce the food that we need? And Dr. Lackner, the technology innovations, as you said, can we bring down the cost of an innovation like this one in order to continue growing and maintaining our living standards? I discussed a little bit about financial instruments and capital mobilization, but the conclusion of all this is we are working on having a healthy two things: a healthy nature and healthy society, no? And that's the objective that we are all looking for, and that's the conclusion of today's conversation. I don't know if we still have time for Q&A. I guess we don't. We canceled the Q&A.
Sorry.
But sorry about that. We have to finish. So please, your closing.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution, which is very, very much appreciated. I'm sorry we have no time left, but our speakers are here, and if you have individual questions, I'm sure they'll be very happy to chat with you after the meeting is closed. So on behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta and our co-sponsor, the Principality of Monaco, I thank you for your engagement today, and I hope that we will leave inspired to turn challenges into opportunities, so that we can all work together for a future that honors both our shared responsibility to care for our common home, but also our shared responsibility to care for each other. Thank you, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.